Well, I'd just like to thank you for being here this morning. A lot of people have been up to the battlefield. Has anyone actually been up there and walked around? I know several.
Oh, wow.
Probably have. It's quite a fascinating place, and I just never get tired of going there. I get tired once I'm there hiking around, but I don't ever get tired of going back. So it's such a cool place. So basically the foundation of this presentation was based on an exhibit that we did at the Sheridan County Museum many years ago when I was the director there. And so it's kind of just a brief overview. By all means, we do not know everything about this battle because there's a lot to know, and it would probably take all day to tell you, even if we did. So this is pretty much just a general overview. We don't go into every detail of every movement of the troops because you'd probably fall asleep or just get ready and leave if we did that. So we're going to hit most of the high points, and if we leave out a part that you're immensely familiar with or that you'd like to talk about, we're happy for you to also contribute what you know as well. So just feel free to kind of speak up. So we've got some slides, we've got maps, and some of the maps are animated, so little things will move around on the maps to kind of direct your attention to where the action was, so you can kind of be on the lookout for that. Basically, I have a script so that I don't just ramble on about things, and it gets me to the point, and I don't leave anything out, hopefully, that I really think is good to add. So Kevin will add some things, and we'll just start. Oh, good, we've got some more people. It's not church. Please come forward to the front.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Kathy. But yeah, we certainly don't want to be college professors just lecturing at you. Seriously, if you want any discussion or questions, just jump on in. The exact right amount of chairs?
Well, I'm sure more are coming because our information is 2:30.
Did you ever find any more chairs?
Yes, I did, and I can bring more
Okay.
if need be, so I'm keeping an eye on it.
Okay.
Also, some of the advertising said we were going to talk about archaeology. I hope that doesn't disappoint anybody, but we're not going to talk about the archaeology. Should we keep waiting?
Nah.
Wait. Okay.
We'll press on.
All right. Well, we can just jump right on in here.
And just tell me next slide when you need another slide.
Okay.
Since we're doing the angle.
Okay. This is going to be a little great with bifocals and a flashlight. So. Okay, the struggle is real. Okay. All right, we'll just jump on in here. The Rosebud Battle of 1876 is one of the most important Indian War battles of the American West. But if you visit the battlefield today, you won't find souvenirs, granite monuments, or busloads of tourists, hopefully. Only a few interpretive panels mark the site of the momentous battle between Lieutenant General George Crook and his Sioux and Cheyenne adversaries. Oops.
Yeah, that was meant to be.
That's the one right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are just a couple of scenes. That's where I should have read this text here. Of the battlefield. And if you've been up there, it looks kind of like this because these photos are only about 10 years old. Okay, next. Thank you. Although overshadowed throughout history by the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Rosebud Battle is significant because the Indians used new tactics on the Rosebud that the Army did not anticipate. Completely unaware that their Indian opponents had changed their methods, General George Crook would have the fight of his life that day, and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer would discover the consequences 8 days later when his outnumbered command met the Indian veterans of the Rosebud. Next, please. And throughout this presentation, we'll use these maps that were provided to us by the, we're missing some of this slide.
Because the projector's not aimed right?
Something's, not quite right. Anyway, we'll just carry on. On the morning of June 17, 1876, Crook's command of 1,300 soldiers, miners, and Crow and Shoshone auxiliaries paused along Rosebud Creek, a north-flowing tributary of the Yellowstone River. Crook's orders were to capture or destroy the large Sioux and Cheyenne village, believed to be on the Rosebud Creek, and force the Indians back onto the reservations. Keep going.
Go ahead.
Okay. Next, please.
Until we get to more pictures.
Oh, let's just change the colors of the background. That's interesting. Okay. But the Indians were not inclined to stay put on the reservations. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 set aside roughly 125,000 square miles of reservation lands in western South Dakota, eastern Wyoming, and southeastern Montana. While the treaty allowed the Lakota to roam and hunt in the unceded territory west of the Great Sioux Reservation, it did not recognize Lakota ownership of those lands.
Right, so this is the unceded territory, right? Had been promised as hunting grounds, but now you're hostile if you're out there.
Next, please. Oh, yes. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry led an expedition into the Black Hills to report on the presence of gold. The subsequent discovery of gold in the most sacred Sioux land brought a flood of miners which the government could not control. The government then tried to evict the miners and purchase the Black Hills from the Sioux, but both of these efforts failed. Let me know when you want to take over. Okay, next please. When the Indians living on the reservations refused to sell the Black Hills to the government, the Grant administration concocted a scheme to seize the land by force. If the non-reservation roamers could be declared hostile, military action against them would serve as the pretext to resolve the whole question of ownership. The winter roamers were therefore ordered to report to their agencies by January 31st, 1876, or face military action. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other like-minded roamers had no intention of honoring Washington's ultimatum, however. On February 3rd, the Indian Bureau requested the War Department enforce compliance. Next, please. So now the Army is called out to deal with the situation. The Army ordered columns of soldiers from 3 directions to find the Indians and force them back onto the reservations. Colonel John Gibbon commanded troops from Fort Ellis in the Montana Territory. Representing the Department of the Dakota, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer led the 7th Cavalry west from Fort Abraham Lincoln. And General George Crook led the largest contingent from Fort Fetterman, Wyoming Territory. This plan was notable for several deficiencies, and this is where people really get excited. First, there would be no commander in charge of all 3 columns. I know this seems like it's really wacky, but that's how they planned it. And there was no plan for the commanders to coordinate their actions once they took to the field. They were so far apart they couldn't really communicate because they didn't know where each of the other contingents were. They had scouts, they had people that could deliver messages, but they just couldn't cover all of this territory to figure out where their other people were. The reason for this lack of coordination was that General Sheridan believed that any one of the 3 contingents would be sufficient to make the Sioux and Cheyenne comply. They had so much faith in their own abilities that they thought, oh, either one of these groups could make them go back onto the reservations. So that's why they didn't have an overall plan to join up and fight en masse. I know it seems weird today, but that's how they thought back then. You want me to keep going? Or are you gonna?
Yeah, I'll do.
This section is, all those pictures.
Yeah, exactly. So, next slide, please. I just kind of, you've seen some of these already. I have kind of become obsessed with the sketches that correspondents who were there were making and then sending to Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, Harper's Weekly. There was there was a lot of correspondence on this expedition.
And we'll name them in just
later we talk about it. So this is a picture of a sketch by Charles St. George Stanley. You'll see a lot of his of Fort Fetterman. Crook's column departed Fort Fetterman on May 29th. Named the Bighorn and Yellowstone Expedition, it consisted of 15 companies of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry Regiments and 5 companies of the 4th and 9th Infantry Regiments, plus about 100 civilian teamsters and 250 mules. Later, 65 Montana miners and 276 Indian auxiliaries would increase Crook's fighting force to around 1,300 men. And I mean, people would just kind of conglomerate around, just kind of join up and just kind of hide amongst the army and go with them to go mining and fishing and hunting too. Next, please. Another sketch of Fort Fetterman. Kind of cool. Do we know who did this one? You just say officers in the field, I wonder. 6 journalists accompanied the expedition. These included John Finnerty of the Chicago Times, Thomas B. McMillan of the Chicago Inter-Ocean, Reuben Davenport for the New York Herald, Robert A. Strayhorn for the Denver Rocky Mountain News, Joseph Wasson of the San Francisco Alta California, and Charles St. George Stanley for Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper. Lieutenant James Foster provided sketches to Harper's Weekly. So I mean, even though we didn't have photography or video or anything like that, this was a heavily documented expedition in real time. Next, please. And so honestly, as I was learning about the Rosebud, I just found it really interesting to learn about the context of the entire expedition, of all the build-up to the Battle of the Rosebud and then the Battle of Little Bighorn, because they didn't just pop out of nowhere into this area. They had to move all of these supplies and soldiers, from all the various forts that they were being called from, and get them all in coordination and moving together, and it was quite an undertaking. The movement of Crook's column north took so much coordination, preparation, and materials that their presence was impossible to conceal on the open plains. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians, traveling light in a landscape they knew intimately, were able to quietly observe and stalk the troops almost from the moment they entered the Powder River Basin. And I mean, this Crook, very much part of his strategy was to rely on his scouts, for one, Indian scouts, but also, as they call them, Indian auxiliaries, actual warriors who would fight with his soldiers, because he just knew that no one would know the terrain and the behaviors of their enemies as well as his Indian allies. So he had sent ahead, he had sent Frank Gruard and a few other scouts to try and recruit these auxiliaries, and then he just had to wait for them to come back. And so every day he was anxiously looking around for when are these guys going to come back. Next, please. So the landscape and landmarks they encountered on the way north are familiar to anyone who's traveled from Casper to Sheridan on the interstate. This is a sketch of the column crossing Crazy Woman. Next, please. These are some various sketches from Fort Phil Kearny and the Fetterman massacre site, which was kind of a solemn camp for them. And of course, this memorial was built. You see that in 2 different sketches, somebody has, at first I thought it was just a remnant of a chimney or something, but somebody pointed out to me that it actually was the memorial of the time. But of course, these places couldn't be maintained. They were so far out into the frontier, that the graves were desecrated, and this was not a maintained memorial site. Next, please. And actually, there seems to be an indication. Oh, next. that it's, if I read it correctly, it was at this, like they camped here, and there was some hunting party of Sioux that started kind of trailing them at that point. And so watched their every movement from then on. Okay, welcome folks. I am sorry if there's a mix-up on the start time. We just started a little bit ago to kind of split the difference. So then there was this interesting deal where basically it seems like Crook got a little lost and meant to come to the Goose Creek, but instead went down Prairie Dog until it hit the Tongue River. And that's what this is picturing, is a camp that they made right at the mouth of Prairie Dog Creek where it meets the Tongue River. And they just decided to camp there and wait and see if their scouts would return. So they were there for days, just kind of having foot races and playing cards and cleaning their weapons. At one point there was even a weird incident where in the middle of the night a voice called down from the bluffs across the Tongue River, and it's, seemed to be speaking in Crow, asking if there was any Crow scouts there, if the Crows had returned yet. Well, their Crow-speaking scouts were out, and so the only guy who knew any Indian language only spoke Sioux, and he tried speaking back in Sioux up to the bluff and scared this person away. So when Crook heard about that in the morning, he was like, oh no, they tried to come into camp, but now they don't trust us, was kind of his feeling. But then, let's see, I must have, what occurred is referred to as the Tongue River, or skirmish, or the battle at Tongue River Heights. And I won't go into great detail on it, but let's see, it was on June 9th, as everyone was finishing dinner, shots were fired by men tending the picket line to the east. James Foster described to the Chicago Tribune, "We had not time to even express and form an opinion as to what was the matter with the picket when a rattling volley was fired into the camp from the heights on the other side of Tongue River. A number of Indians were seen running around the crest of the cliff, firing their breech loaders, making themselves especially unpleasant and remarkably noisy, while one, who appeared to be the principal musician in the serenade, kept galloping up and down as though he had lost something and was in a great hurry to find it." And there's a lot of great, this was the first chance for these correspondents to have some flowery language, right? Oh my, it's probably my credit card company.
The things people didn't have to deal with.
And so this continued on. They were firing into the camp pretty ineffectively, hitting tents, wagons, and the Indians would ride up to the edge of the bluff and then turn and fall back out of range. But Crook, so it was kind of like almost seen as fun, if you can put it that way. People were, yelling insults and they were taking it sort of lightly, but Crook and the other senior leadership were not so amused. The fact that the Indians were able to have the high ground, keep the soldiers pinned down, and the soldiers couldn't seem to hit anything, made Crook pretty quickly want to send over some cavalry to clear the heights. And they did. They pretty easily, once they made their way up that little, ravine there, kind of in a preview of what would happen at the Rosebud. They would fire and then retreat and then hide behind outcroppings and attack and retreat until eventually it wasn't worth it chasing them any further, basically. But so no, there was no serious casualties, no deaths. And so if anything, the officers and Crook saw it as, at least our guys are on their toes now, at least they're waking up to what we face out here. And so they did a lot. They were a lot less casual. They started posting guards up on the top of the high ground nearby and stuff like that. And of course it was 8 days later that the Rosebud occurred, and then another 8 days later that the Battle of the Little Bighorn occurred. And later it became evident from stories told by Indian warriors that yeah, this was a group of Indian scouts who had been sent because they'd been tracking this column to come and look at what was going on down here, and they I think the plan was to stampede the horses, just cause chaos in the camp, maybe steal a few horses if possible, just make everybody's life hard. So let's see what's next. Next slide, please. Just another shot, this one by a different sketch artist of that location. Next one, that's another angle of the same location. I just always find it fascinating. We have such great documentation of all this. Yep. Sure. Or maybe I'll do this last one.
Yeah, you go ahead.
What are we doing here? Yeah, because this is good for you. So on June 11th, let's go to the next slide, please. The column. No, you got to do this one.
Okay.
You got to. Because this is your research, man.
Okay. Whoopsie. Okay. So on June 11th, the column reached the confluence of Big and Little Goose Creeks, where Crook established Camp Cloud Peak. In the area that later became downtown Sheridan, they were joined by the 276 Crow and Shoshone Indians, who agreed to fight with the whites against their bitter enemies, the Sioux and Cheyenne. Now, if this view looks very confusing and not much like the view from downtown Sheridan, it is because there were multiple locations for Camp Cloud Peak. The huge encampment had to move every 2 to 3 days so that there was fresh grass for the horses and mules. We suspect that this view by Charles St. George Stanley was a composite view of the many camps, or one of the camps on Little Goose Creek, closer to the present-day Bighorn than to Sheridan. Also, for quite some time, it was thought that the island that many correspondents mentioned where the wagons were formed in a circle was the one that used to be in the area of Brooks Street in Sheridan before Big Goose Creek was rerouted. Next, please. However, in doing the research for the Camp Cloud Peak diorama that's in the Wyoming room at the library, we found that the circled wagons would not have fit in that small area, and that there were several other so-called islands which were formed by the winding cirques or oxbows of Big and Little Goose Creeks, where that scene could have appeared quite easily. The whole topic of these additional campsites is very fascinating and would be a fine subject for another complete program. And my husband had done quite a lot of research into where those places were based on the descriptions from everybody who said, we moved the camp so many miles on this date. And he tried to track that, and of course this was about 10 or 12 years ago, so he's probably forgotten by now, but it was terribly interesting at the time, and if anybody wants to take that up again, that would be really, really cool. You may have also heard the opinion that General Crook's headquarters tent was located close to the present-day site of the Sheridan Inn, and this is entirely possible also. When Crook's command returned from the Rosebud, it set up camp again, and not in the same location as before the battle, due to the same grass situation. So the inn's location was probably one of these sites also. While awaiting supplies and reinforcements, Crook's command whiled away the time fishing and hunting and exploring along Big and Little Goose Creeks for most of the summer. And so the day after they left to go to the Rosebud, the command that was left at Camp Cloud Peak moved the site. So when they came back, it was not in the same location as where they left. So that's how often they had to move, every 2 or 3 days, for grass for the horses. So on that night, the Indian...
Next, please.
Oh, yes, sorry. The Indian allies held a grand war council with General Crook and his officers. Chief Plenty Coup of the Crow informed General Crook that Sitting Bull's village was nearby on Rosebud Creek. But this information was about a month old. After a council fire, the Indian allies went to their camp where they donned war paint and held a noisy war dance in preparation for the battle.
Yeah, it was quite the evening for all the soldiers with that going on all night.
Next, please. Oh, now this was, we're going to talk about this guy.
Yeah, and I just included an anecdote because I thought it was, as I said, I'm obsessed with these sketches, and they would always kind of find these dramatic moments. This is a guy, a Crow elder named Whiteflower. So as they're talking to these Indian auxiliaries, right, they have to relay each command, each sentence basically, and then wait for it to be interpreted and so everyone could hear it in each of their languages. So it went late into the night, these discussions. And I think this might have been the next morning, actually, that Whiteflower was talking to his Crow warriors saying, they're going to give you rifles, but you're going to need to give them back afterwards. Which, if you go to the next slide, this is out of chronological order, but then later after the Battle of the Rosebud, another incident was recorded by the sketch artist where they were riding off without giving back the rifles, and he implored them, and they did. Every single one of them came back and piled up the rifles that they had been issued. And I just thought that was a fun anecdote. I guess I'll do a few more. Next. So, and then this is a fun and interesting episode. Crook had a lot of innovations. He used pack trains to get a lot of supplies in fast, but one of the advantages of that was then having the mules that you could, if you found a village and you wanted to move fast, you could put your infantry on the mules so that you've got cavalry and infantry on horseback, I guess. But mules don't like to be ridden, right? And so it was like a whole day of finding the right ones, finding the right gear. Some of these guys didn't even have a saddle. What is it called? There's a device that's just like a strap around the horse's belly. You can put a saddle blanket under, And so every guy had to find the right gear and the right mule, and so it's been called I'll read it here. On June 15th, Crook mounted his infantry on 200 unbroken wagon mules so the command could travel further and faster. As mules bucked and infantrymen flew through the air, our area's first rodeo amused the cavalry and the Crow and Shoshone allies. It was really hard for these guys to get respect. I mean, even as they were out on the column towards the Rosebud, they kind of got laughed at. The wagons would be left on Goose Creek, and each man took one blanket or his greatcoat, 4 days of rations, 100 rounds of ammunition. And the pack mules carried medical supplies, ammunition, and grain for the horses. I'll do one more. Next, please. Sitting Bull's village was no longer on the Rosebud, but on a tributary of the Little Bighorn River, about 60 miles further from Crook. Crook did not realize that many winter roamers from other Lakota bands, including the Sans Arc, Hunkpapa, Brule, Blackfeet, Miniconjou, and Cheyenne, had also joined Sitting Bull's Ogalallas. The camp's estimated population of 7,000 people included 1,500 to 2,000 warriors, and was probably the largest assemblage of Indians on the northern plains. Still acting on faulty intelligence from his Indian allies, Crook departed from the Rosebud's headwaters on June 16th. Crow scouts ranging ahead of the column ran into a small party of Cheyenne who returned to the main camp and alerted Sitting Bull of the soldiers' presence. Sitting Bull and the head chiefs sent about 1,000 warriors under Crazy Horse to head off the soldiers before they could reach the village.
Kevin?
Yes?
Can you just pause a second and kind of point all of that out in just words? Like pointing in words. I'm having trouble.
Would you?
So even just to orient us I've driven all of this, but to know where the Tongue River is going in, or where the Prairie Dog Creek is.
Okay. See the 9 there?
Here's Prairie Dog.
down here.
Yep.
And this is the big blue one is the Tongue River.
So where's Sheridan now? Give us orientation on where Sheridan.
Little Goose, kind of down.
See where the two Goose
Oh,
Creeks
right
come
here,
together?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And then here's the Rosebud right up here.
And that's the exit that you go up by going out to Billings?
No. It's going up toward Decker.
Right.
Going out towards.
The road goes right past Decker right there.
Okay.
And where they ended up, well,
Is that on the next one?
maybe it's on the next one.
Next one.
Oh, not yet.
So this that you're showing way up at the top there with all the red arrows, so go back over that again, just
Yeah.
real quick. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's no problem. No, that's where the Indian village actually was. And over here is where they thought it was. Crook thought it was here because his Indian allies said it was.
And it had been.
It had been.
It was
there.
constantly moving.
But they moved between creeks. They moved from over here over to Reno Creek.
They went over to Sioux Pass.
Because they had the same problem, they needed grass for the horses or whatever.
True.
Right?
And they were just hunting bison as opportunistically.
Okay.
All right, you want to?
Oh, sure.
And please ask
Yeah.
if you need clarification.
Yeah, it's hard to spot it, you know, it's like, I think we're so town oriented now to think about a map like this.
And that's the other reason why there are little animations in the map that kind of point these things out, but they go pretty fast sometimes. Oh, next please. On June 17th, the command advanced further up Rosebud Creek and stopped to rest at about 8 a.m. Horses were unsaddled to graze and men lit fires to boil coffee while the scouts probed northward. About 30 minutes later, a Shoshone scout named Humpy galloped back down to the camp shouting, "Heap Sioux, heap Sioux," closely followed by Crazy Horse's warriors. The scouts formed a skirmish line about 500 yards from the resting column and held off the attack for about 20 minutes, giving Crook time to deploy his forces.
And this would be the
This is
spot, yeah. So, I mean, I did hand out a map to try and help because I know this is a top-down kind of battle strategy type of map. And so in that one, I tried to show you the topography in Google Earth so you'd have a sense. But the idea being that they call this the Big Bend in Rosebud. It goes north here. It goes from east-west to north-south. So they're camped out down here in, the valley. And they can't see. They can't see up this way or up this way. And the Sioux are coming down off of the bluffs. And so they're hearing shots. They know there's warriors attacking, but they can't see, right? And so they tried to get to a higher ground, and there's actually a lot of quotes from people who are there, but I pulled one out because it was from someone we might recognize. Oliver P. Hanna, who, was the first homesteader in Sheridan, right? Well, Bighorn. So he was among the knot of civilians hanging close to Crook and reached the ridge at about the same time as the Crows and Shoshones did in their renewed attack and watched them engage the enemy. So, I mean, right away, the auxiliaries, the Crows and Shoshones, were holding off the warriors as the cavalry was getting itself mounted and all of this. He watched them engage the enemy. The firing was fast and furious, he wrote. The Indians seemed to be as thick as blackbirds. If one of them fell from a shot, a dozen were there to take his place. And then here's another observer. I don't know who it is. In front of them, to the right, to the left, the low bluffs, including the plain, were ringed with Indians in full war gear. They looked like swarms of blackbirds. There were so many of them and in such rapid motion. They kept coming and coming into view, and as they dashed up to the brink of the hills upon their war ponies, they opened a long-range fire upon the soldiers. And it just goes on and on. There's a lot of people who kind of describe it that same way as just a mass of humanity on the largest amount of Indian warriors they had ever seen in their life.
And some of the soldiers and officers said that also, and you can imagine how scary that would look.
Okay. Next, please.
This is one of the later art pieces done by this illustrator by the name of William Roycewig. I believe it was done in the 1950s, and several of his drawings are included here, and they just really add a lot because they give a visual representation of what was occurring. Next, please. Vulnerable in the lowland along Rosebud Creek, Crook quickly dispatched his troops to push the warriors off the high ground. He sent Captain Anson Mills to the northeast, and that would be on the right-hand side, and Captain Frederick Van Vliet to the south, where he arrived just in time to prevent the Sioux from reaching the high ground there first. And I believe on our map here, the sides are cut off just a little bit and the bottom is cut off just a little bit. But where the Rosebud goes around here, there's lots of varied terrain. And then there's a big huge mountain or hill right over here, which was a high ground also. And so Mills and several other troops were engaged in this area, because everywhere you see the red, that's where the Sioux and Cheyenne were coming down to attack. And the blue just represents where the soldiers had to go and counter those attacks. And these little arrows are supposed to be not white. I'm not sure why that's happening, but
Oh, that's true.
yeah, the colors are getting kind of changed around on us a little bit. So, but the arrows show where the troops went there. I hope they do.
And luckily for them, they were able to get up onto that bluff on the south of Rosebud. They call it the Eagle Nest, and keep that, or else they would have been surrounded.
Right. Next, please. The Indians, driven back by the Crow and Shoshone, suddenly turned back and charged the soldiers in a low area between two ridges called the Gap. The soldiers killed the horse of a young Cheyenne chief, comes in sight. Too far away for help from other warriors, the chief's sister, Buffalo Calf Road woman, charged bravely down through the gap, stopped long enough for her brother to jump up behind her, and dashed back to safety. In honor of this daring act, the Cheyennes still refer to this battle as where the girl saved her brother. And probably everybody's heard of that name for the battle also. Next, please. During Captain Anson Mills' second charge in the Gap, which involved driving the warriors from a ridge west of the Buffalo Jump, trumpeter Elmer Snow of Mills Company M sounded the charge. As the battalion wheeled onto line, they ran straight into a hail of fire from the Sioux warriors. In the lead, with his commander, that's okay, Snow was struck by incoming fire in both of his wrists at the same time, leaving his hands useless and dangling. As a result, his horse bolted, carrying Snow right into the middle of the surprised warriors, who kept up the withering fire. Snow somehow managed to turn his horse in a wide circle and avoided certain death. The rest of his company watched Snow's wounding and desperate ride, but were not able to help. Frank Gerard attempted to grab the reins of Snow's horse, but could not get close enough to the frantic animal. Gerard shouted to Snow to throw himself off, but received a rebuking glance from the wounded trumpeter that Gerard mentioned later in his account of the incident. You can just imagine, what, are you crazy? What are you thinking? Or worse, who knows? Gerard then got as close to Snow's horse as he could and hit it in the side of the head, which turned the horse a bit, enabling Snow to finally jump off. Help from his Company M comrades came swiftly, and he was taken to the hospital area. And as you can see from the picture, Elmer Snow lost the use of both of his hands and was later fitted for artificial limbs. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions and also for being wounded that day. And this illustration is just a picture of a cavalry charge. It's not the actual place because you can see snow on the ground. And of course, this happened in June. No snow in June. But it was a nice picture of a charge. So. Next, please. The charge by Captain Mill's troops drove the Indians off the high ground north and east of the Gap, and Crook established his headquarters on a long ridge now known as Crook's Ridge. The warriors fell back to a high knoll known today as Conical Hill. The packers and miners positioned themselves in a rocky outcropping between Crook's position and Conical Hill, where the repeating rifles helped keep Crazy Horse's warriors under fire. Crook then sent Colonel William Royal's cavalry companies to the west to push back attacking Indians and keep them from surrounding the command. And if you'd like, we can point these places out to you if it's not clear. The little circles kind of show where those are.
You're starting to get a sense, though, of why it's such a huge battlefield to go visit. If you really wanted to see everything, you are walking all day long.
It's a long way from one point to the other. Next, please. As soon as Royal's forces pressed the attackers a little further west, he found himself and his 255 men under fire by more than 400 Sioux and Cheyenne. Royal and his men found some cover on high ground that has become known as Royal's Ridge, where they continued to fight. Crook then ordered Royal to fall back, but he was pinned down before he could go very far. After about an hour of fighting at this second position, Royal moved further back down the ridge, but heavy fire from the Sioux and Cheyenne kept him crossing the exposed expanse of Calmer Creek to rejoin Crook. And of course, Calmer Creek doesn't look very big here, but it's really a long way if you're on foot. And there's some very, very steep places. For anyone who was on foot, it would have been taken a long time and been very difficult, and they would be very exposed. So they were kind of pinned down and not able to go back. And if you've walked the battlefield, like I'm sure several of you have, you know how rugged it is and how difficult this could have been. Next, please. Still determined to find and attack the village, General Crook sent Captain Mills and half of the cavalry down the Rosebud. While this made perfect sense if the village had actually been there, this order reduced Crook's fighting force by half, and Crazy Horse's warriors took advantage of the situation to concentrate on Royal's men. And so when you see all the contours of the land there, you realize how easy it was for just bands and small groups of Indians to be behind a little hill and to have kind of a secure location where they could fire down upon the troops. Well, the troops had found those kinds of places too. So it was just back and forth, back and forth. Whenever they could move, they could get to more ground or further away, or they were trying to get back to where Crook was. So it was taking a while.
Well, and if I just interject, I mean,
sure.
It's probably clear already, but he mistakenly thought the village was just around the corner, and that's why he was meeting such resistance. He didn't imagine, in his experience, you didn't have that much resistance unless they were protecting an immediate village. And so this just caught him way off guard, and he made a lot of assumptions that day.
Exactly. Next, please. General Crook then sent 2 companies of infantry and the Crow and Shoshone scouts to provide covering fire while Royal's men crossed Calmer Creek. Now this is an occurrence of the infantry actually arriving to save the cavalry. Usually in movies it's the other way around, but this time the infantry were the heroes at this spot right here. I used to work for an infantry regiment museum, so I gained a great respect for what the infantry can do. As Royal's men made their retreat, some of the fiercest fighting of the battle occurred, and 5 soldiers were killed and 10 wounded, including the ever-popular Captain Guy V. Henry. Next, please. While Captain Henry was directing his men's fire towards the charging Sioux and Cheyenne, he was shot through the face and fell from his horse. Shocked at the sight of their prostrate leader, Henry's men fell back. The captain's body had no more than touched the ground when hostiles, intent on counting coup on the white chief, charged in to reach his body. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting took place over Henry and his wounded orderly when the Crows and Shoshones rushed in to defend the 2 men. Shoshone warrior Taiji was credited with holding back the hostiles until the troops come up. And luckily we have a picture of Taiji that was taken later, of course. So he became pretty famous after this. Lots of people thought that Chief Washakie was at the battle, but he was not actually there. His sons were there, and sometimes they were called chiefs. And so that led to a lot of confusion as to whether the old Chief Washakie was there, but he was actually far away at the time. Let's see where
Sure, what is it? Oh, yeah.
Lincoln.
So, one thing that Dana and I just kind of started to comment on was, yes, a lot of us have heard of the girl who saved her brother, but as you see, we keep having these similar type of stories. It was kind of the, just the fact of the battlefield, that there wasn't a really great front, and there was a lot of advances and retreats to where individuals would end up getting, into trouble, stranded behind enemy lines, and there would be a dramatic rescue of some kind where everyone who was there and saw it would talk about it forever after. It's just, we don't even have time to go into all these, but one of the other famous ones is Limpy's rescue. If we go to the next slide. Another Rosebud rescue story took place during the ebb and flow of the fighting along Colmar Creek. It involved the thrilling escape of the 18-year-old Cheyenne warrior by the name of Limpy. Limpy walked with difficulty due to a crippling leg injury several years earlier. On the day of the battle, Limpy fought fearlessly with fellow warriors Yellow Blackbird, Chief Comes in Sight, Young Two Moon, White Bird, and Louie Dog. When the Cheyenne group was pinned down by fire from the soldiers, they decided to escape the rocky bluffs one at a time, leaving Limpy, the youngest among them, the last to leave. When his turn came, Limpy's horse went wild and bucked him off before dropping dead from a bullet wound. Limpy then limped his way back to the rocky outcropping after braving a shower of bullets while recovering his horse's bridle. As the Army scouts rushed in to kill and count coup on Limpy, Young Two Moon saw Limpy's plight and called him to be ready for a rescue. Due to his infirmity, Limpy couldn't mount Two Moon's horse from the ground, so he climbed up on top of the rocks and jumped on behind Two Moon as he rode by, narrowly escaping the attacking scouts. Next slide, please. Seeing the desperate fighting to extricate Royal, Crook recalled Mills, who was still cautiously probing for the village. Directed to exit the Rosebud Canyon and head west, Mills' troops swung around behind the Indian concentrations, forcing them to break off the fight. Next, please. The Indians, tired and hungry by now, decided to call it quits. They had earned many war honors, collected a few weapons, protected their village, and learned that they could defeat a large body of troops. Next slide. Considering the magnitude of the conflict, casualties on both sides were light. Of the roughly 2,500 combatants, General Crook reported 9 men killed and 21 wounded, while Cheyenne and Sioux losses were only slightly higher. Both of these photos shown here were taken by Stanley J. Morrow later that summer as the campaign concluded in the Black Hills. Do you want to talk about those photos a little bit, or just, it's basically just showing recreations, I guess you would call it, right?
Right. Later on, after Crook's troops came from the battle and came back to the Sheridan area, they went out again later in the summer, and they went towards the Black Hills. So there was actually a photographer in the group of journalists that was with the command then. So that's why we have pictures from that part of the campaign, but not the part that we're interested in, at the Rosebud. But these two pictures do show how they were able to transport the wounded on a travoy behind a mule, and also using 2 mules and long poles in between 2 mules to make kind of a litter. And the litter method was how they brought Captain Guy V. Henry back from the battle. And actually along the way, the terrain that they went over was so broken and so horrible that he was ejected from the litter and then fell down a little ravine. In addition to being shot through the face and being blind in one eye. And he replied very stoically, he said, "It is nothing, dear man, for this we are soldiers." So.
Well, that reminds me of there was a rescue story we didn't even talk about of a Crow warrior named Bull Snake, and he was shot through his kneecap. And as he was being carried, he made a lot of similar comments. Every time there'd be a grinding that everyone around him could hear, he'd say, "Oh, there goes a little more bone to powder." Do you want to finish this up?
Sure. Next, please. Now, when I say this, we might get into a big argument. We almost did last week. And if you have a different opinion, that's fine, because, it's okay. So I'm going to say the battle was technically a draw, and technically is just technically. It's not like etched in stone. Okay, it's an opinion. General Crook claimed victory since he held the battlefield, and in the 19th century, if you held the battlefield, you could consider yourself the winner. But really, it was also a strategic victory for the Indians. They had fought the largest of the 3 army columns, forcing them to withdraw back to their supply base on Goose Creek. And they actually just kind of gave up because it was in the afternoon. They had ridden all night to get there, and they were probably tired and hungry and didn't see much future in continuing to do what they were doing. So they kind of just took off. So that's kind of why it was a draw, for those 2 funny reasons. And if you have a different idea about this, that's fine. You're welcome to share that with us. While Crook's command awaited supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements, it was taken out of action. So that really was a victory for the Indians, because if Crook had continued on in the field, he might have been able to be a little bit of use for later portions of the battle, especially the one 8 days later at the Little Bighorn. But alas, that is not what actually happened. So the Indians did force him to come back to Camp Cloud Peak to resupply and await reinforcements. So Crook got a lot of complaints about that, and a lot of criticism by his own troops and by the higher ups in the Army and in Washington. The Sioux and Cheyenne, next please. The Sioux and Cheyenne were emboldened by their victory over Crook's troops at the Rosebud, and were convinced that by fighting the soldiers, they could retain their freedom and way of life. Confidence was high when 8 days later, they handed the Army its greatest defeat of the Plains Indian Wars at the Little Bighorn. And of course, immortalized by many artists at the same time. Next, please. So we'd like to suggest that for definitive works on this battle, you could read Neil Mangum's book, The Battle of the Rosebud, Prelude to the Little Bighorn, and another more recent book by Paul Hedren, who is a well-known author of books and histories on the Great Sioux War of 1876. And his book is quite comprehensive, but the title is very similar. His title is called Rosebud, June 17th, 1876, Prelude to the Little Bighorn. So if you don't remember anything about this, remember it was the Prelude to the Little Bighorn. Now, if you feel like we've left anything interesting out, or if you'd like to contribute a little bit to this, an opinion or something that you found fascinating about the battle, we'd love to hear from you. So.
Can we turn the lights too?
And then this area was opened up.
Thank you.
Would you like to have
Hey, thanks a lot for great job.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming.